Some photographs don't just show us a place. They draw us into its rhythms, its tensions, and the stories that unfold quietly in between. Close to the Bayou, the ongoing project by photographer Dimitri Staszewski, does just that. Through his photographs, Dimitri brings us into the lives of people living along the Mississippi River, a region marked by beauty, resilience, and deep cultural roots. Dimitri doesn't rush the picture. He takes his time. There's a sense of presence in the work, not just in what's shown, but in what's felt. He isn't just documenting a place, he's building a relationship with it. In this episode, I speak with Dimitri about the evolution of Close to the Bayou, how it began, how it's changed him, and what it means to make photographs that grow from trust and time. We talk about the sensitivity that's necessary when documenting with someone going through a health crisis and how his own health diagnosis changed his work and his life. This is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame. Well, Dimitri, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be on.
Thanks for reaching out. I mean, the cover alone of your book, Close to the Bayou, is like very interesting. We'll talk a little bit about why that choice was there. But, this whole book and this whole project revolves around a longtime family friend, Tom. And, he strikes me as the real cool uncle.
Yeah.
That when he would visit, he would be, the kind of guy that kids would really look forward to because he was such a departure from the norm.
Yeah, exactly.
So before we start talking about, the images in the book, and tell me about that relationship.
Yeah, I would describe him exactly like that. Like, we're not related by blood, but would definitely consider him an uncle figure in my life. And growing up, as I kind of get into in the book, he would come to my family's home at least once a year for these jewelry craft shows. My dad is part of a community of craft jewelers, which is kind of a specific niche within the jewelry world. And I'm just differentiating it from it's not like stuff like Tiffany or Bulgari or anything like that. It's like these artisans, craftsmen, craftswomen, and goldsmiths, silversmiths who are just making really, really interesting work that is outside of the norm, where every individual has their own unique style. And so my dad's style is very like linear, geometric, clean, crisp, this coming out of this German tradition of goldsmithing. And then Tom is this just wild man, hippie. He was actually at Woodstock back in the day. So he's from Allentown, Pennsylvania. So just like polar opposite person to my father. And he would always bring like suitcases full of his jewelry. And every year it would be different stuff that I hadn't seen from the year before. And while my dad is also one of my biggest inspirations, just artistically, Tom's work was just so playful and whimsical. There's like all this, red plexiglass and movement in his work that just really, as a kid, I really gravitated towards, because even outside of the differentiation from it being so unique and different from my father's work, but I think just inherently the work is really interesting and wild. And so as a kid, I was just really, he would always he didn't care about me holding it or playing with it or, dropping it or anything like that. And so he would always just, throw it around, show us stuff, teach me and my brother how to bend wire and stuff like that. And that, that was when we were like 8 years old. So it was very formative from a very early age to have this presence in my life.
You talk about your dad's German heritage. What did that look like in terms of, what the household was like, so that we can get a better sort of comparison how Tom's presence would bring a completely different energy to
I don't know how much explain or not explain. So maybe I can just explain my family background, and if there's too. So,
please.
My father, he grew up in the Netherlands. He was the son of Holocaust survivors. So his parents came to the Netherlands as refugees after World War II. My grandmother was basically in the Underground Railroad in Europe, and my grandfather was in a concentration camp. So my father eventually went to Germany to study goldsmithing. And so he went to Germany to study goldsmithing, eventually met an American who lived in Berkeley, California at that goldsmithing school, and immigrated to the US on a tourist visa, and eventually overstayed that visa, and eventually, worked under the table for years, and eventually got a green card, just because that was a possibility at the time. Obviously, there's more to that story, but I think, and then my mom's parents were Italian immigrants. So that's all to say that growing up, I was living in this like kind of recently American household for sure. And I think, well, my family's entire history doesn't relate to my dad's tendencies or anything like that. I think there is something specific about being a German trained goldsmith that is like a pretty specific experience. I mean, he's generally like, I would say like a type A person, but the style that he was working within was also this just like super clean, or he continues to work within, is super clean, linear, contemporary, and then you had Tom, who lives in New Orleans, is this, has long hair, grew up a hippie, and kind of bootstrapped his business from the age of like 22 years old. So they were just coming at things, and he's the opposite. He's like not type A at all. Like he makes a mess wherever he goes. And he also like makes wherever he is like home for however long he's there. So it was funny because I would say that like my dad and Tom are very close friends, and they always would get in an argument every time Tom would stay at my house. So it was like, and I think in a way that like only close friends can kind of get it under each other's skin. And obviously he was always like more than welcome to be in our home. But just as an example, like my dad is someone who is like very particular about his tools. So Tom might inevitably break some sort of kitchen tool, and my dad would freak out about that. That's just like a simple example that inevitably happened a few times, but is just like, and I think just like culturally, he was just bringing this spirit of creativity into our home. I think both of my parents are very creative, but maybe Tom's expression of creativity was much more outward, I would say. It was much more like I would say he's like the archetype of an artist to me in my life. Like when you talk to Tom and you ask him like, oh, what do you do for work? He just says, oh, I'm an artist. And whereas my dad would always say, I'm a goldsmith, I'm a jeweler. And I think the differentiation there was that Tom's medium for his art making was jewelry, whereas a lot of these people in the craft jewelry movement are truly craftsmen. Like they're incredibly skilled at what they do, but there's not necessarily a higher intent. There's not necessarily an artistic intention behind their work. Like they see their work as adornment, like this wearable art, but there's not like a artistic intention behind that other than just making something incredibly beautiful.
Okay. So at some point you were sort of interested in following in their footsteps, but you transitioned to photography. So
I mean,
tell me about
high school,
that
I was
journey.
Making jewelry. When I think I was 12 or 13 years old, I basically growing up, I always told my parents I'm going to be a jeweler when I grow up. And so when I think I was 12 or 13, I just told my dad one summer, like, well, I might as well start learning now. Can you start teaching me? And he started giving me at 12 or whatever, he started giving me the exercises that he had gotten in goldsmithing school. And so I just took to it right away. I loved it. I was good at it. I was just naturally interested in it. And I just really loved the kind of physicality of sawing, filing, and soldering, which are the three main components of jewelry making, or kind of the kind of like the foundation. But then it's a long story, but basically as I got towards the end of high school, I had some experiences taking classes at a couple of different art schools where it felt like, because I had learned so much both from my father and then from Tom, I apprenticed with him in New Orleans when I was in high school, when I was like 16. I felt that the education that I would receive from the art schools in the US just weren't, like, I'd already kind of exceeded what some of the teachers were even capable of teaching, which isn't to at all minimize the level of skill that exists, but it kind of just felt like if I want to be the best version of a jeweler, I could just train with my dad and his friends. Like, I don't need to go to art school to do that. And of course, that was because of the very specific experiences I had had. I'm not trying to like minimize the skill of other teachers out there. But simultaneously, I actually fell in love with audio engineering while I was in high school. I had played music my whole life and ended up taking an audio engineering class my junior year of high school. And again, just fell right into it, was obsessed with it. And eventually my senior year decided to go to school in New Orleans for audio engineering. And again, this is a very roundabout way of getting to it, but that path eventually led me to do this documentary audiovisual project in Mongolia, where I was documenting performances of nomadic herders. I was documenting musical performances by nomadic herders throughout Mongolia. And eventually, after college, applied for a Fulbright grant to do that for what ended up being about 9 or 10 months. And so I was living in Mongolia for that period, doing that research project. And it was during that time that I just started making a ton of images, just because I'd be living with these nomadic communities, looking for singers, recording them. But then there was so much downtime in between. I just used my camera to make images as well. And by the time I came back from Mongolia, that was in 2016, I was just like, this is what I'm going to do.
What struck you as the appeal, of making pictures as opposed to, continuing in the audio engineering or with the jewelry? What was the fascination with making the photographs that you felt like
storytelling was always,
this feels right for me?
I just always have loved storytelling. Like, I think my friends know me as someone who's always telling stories about my own experience, about my family, about my life, whatever it is. And so finding a medium where I was able to, what I loved was that it just kind of photography just gave me this excuse to enter lives that I really had like no other reason to be in. And especially in, like, of course, I was already doing that because of this audio visual project, but I felt like this very specific thing of performances of folk music by nomadic herders in Mongolia was just one tiny part of the bigger picture. And so photography just allowed me to access so much more of Mongolian culture at the time, and has continued to be that in my life. Like, again, there's so many rooms that it's like, if I didn't have a camera, I would have no business being there. But because I do have this excuse, and of course there's like a genuine interest when I'm entering a space, but it just gives you this incredible reason to be in a room, to be in a space, to be let into someone else's life. And then more recently, with just using Tom's, like this close to the Bayou as an example, it's like, I think with that project, it really shifted for me where I didn't need any sort of excuse to be with Tom. Like, he would have happily had me every day for the 3 months of his treatment. But with that project, the photography actually deepened the experience in a way that without the camera, I don't think we would have had the same experience together.
You've focused primarily in documentary photography, photojournalism style photography. But as you said, you didn't have a formal education there. So how did you figure out?
I'm still figuring it out. It's like,
as a photographer telling stories.
But I just started like when I moved to Austin. That's when I moved to Austin in 2018, and I had been doing a little bit of everything before then. Like, I was kind of trying to market myself as like an audio engineer, videographer, and photographer, and it just, I think, was confusing for everyone, including myself. And when I moved here in 2018, I just like made the switch and was like, I'm just focusing on photography. And obviously if something else comes not organically, like I would let that happen. But once I did that, it just gave me more of a focus. So, I mean, initially I was really just figuring it out. Like I remember I got my first assignment for the Statesman, the local paper here, and I didn't no one ever taught me how to caption images or anything like that. So I'm like Googling, how to caption images. I remember before that first assignment, I was like, literally like researching what kind of angles should I get, or like what are the standard images that I need to get for a photojournalism assignment. But at the same time, I think it's all very intuitive. Like there's some like really basic things of like, getting a scene setting shot, getting the close-ups, getting getting details, getting portraits. And all that was like very intuitive for me. And so it was just, I think after that, just a repetition of self-assigning a lot of stories, making it known that I was a photographer. So whenever I heard that a friend of mine or a work colleague needed imagery, like I would be like, oh, like I'm good. Like, let me know when you want to shoot. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. So by the time you started this project, you felt
sure.
pretty
I mean,
confident.
I had been working as a photographer for years.
With photographs.
I had already done a cookbook project. So I'd already made a book before. I had, and that one was like self-published. Like I printed 1,000 copies, so it was like a big project it was a big endeavor, multi-year book project. Yeah. So I think that was really making the cookbook, which was about my grandmother, who's the Italian immigrant I had mentioned. She was 102 when the book was published. Yeah. So it was like, I had plenty of experience through my own personal work and then through freelance work, commercial work, to tell stories. Like that was not something that I was nervous about or didn't have the skill set for. What was different with this project was that initially my goal was to create a documentation of Tom going through cancer treatment and making work throughout that process. And I made the decision to use a medium format film camera. I was making the images all on Mamiya RZ67, which has a very specific look to it. Like it's very shallow. It can be a very shallow depth of field. And it ended up really working for what I was trying to capture. And as I was actually working, this was in 2021. I was working for the Texas Senate in the Capitol during the 2021 legislative session. So I was working 5 days a week as a photographer for the Senate, basically documenting the ongoing session, which I'm really grateful for that job. And this is the context of like COVID is still ongoing. So we're like masked up, getting tested every day. It's a really intense job in a lot of ways. And it was also a really boring job in a lot of ways. So it would be like, I'd be at my desk in a suit at 8 a.m. with nothing to do a lot of the time. And then other times I'd be shooting for 5 hours straight in the session or, around the Capitol, and then having to, deliver those files relatively quickly to various senators' offices and stuff like that. And I was also just personally opposed to a lot of the legislation that was being passed, and you're having to be in the room as that's happening constantly over and over and again. And so I was just like kind of beat down by the job because it was just like, it was kind of like soul crushing in a lot of ways, even though, again, like in many ways, I'm really grateful for the experience. And so then during that same period, I would on Fridays leave straight from work and drive to Houston where Tom was being treated, and kind of enter that drive became this meditation of sorts for me. As I made my way to Houston, I would change my mindset from this very practical kind of documentarian employee of the state, literally, to an artist where I was capturing a close friend going through cancer treatment. And that was, I would say, towards the beginning of the project, I was thinking about art making, but I was not like confidently claiming to be an artist. And I'd get to Houston, and usually that Friday I'd get to the house, help clean the house, basically, because it would be a mess just because, when you're getting treated for cancer 5 days a week, you don't have that energy to do that. And Tom's just like a crazy person in general. So I'd just like clean his house, and then we'd make dinner together and usually stay up till like 2 a.m, just talking about the things we were thinking about, which were, because of the context of COVID, like we were both thinking a lot about mortality. Tom certainly is thinking about that because while he expected to be successfully treated, which he was, I think it kickstarted this, it jump-started these thoughts of like, while I expect to be cured of this cancer, I'm closer to the end of my own artistic journey than I am to the beginning. Whereas for me, I was very much at the beginning. And so it was amazing to just have these, long conversations about death, art making, thinking, just asking him like, why are you continuing to make art knowing that you can't possibly sell everything you've already created, but just knowing that he still has this compulsion to create. And in me, I'm also feeling that similar compulsion of like, outside of my work as a photojournalist, like I think I have something that I want to say personally. And so the Close to the Bayou images very quickly turned from this more documentation of treatment and art making into a documentation of the emotional space that we were sharing. That's how I was kind of seeing it, or just it was a documentation of something non-tangible. Thank you.
No, and I really get that with the book. And I think, and one of the things I was reading about was the fact that because it was COVID and there were so many restrictions, is that traditionally doing a story on someone dealing with cancer would involve their treatments at the hospital. But at the height of COVID, there was no way you're going to get a chance to do that. So just because of the nature of the circumstances, there was a limitation imposed on the project from the get-go. But in many ways, that ends up being a real benefit in terms of how that story ends up taking shape.
Exactly.
So
and I think just as a photojournalist, you're
literal story.
Obviously you're looking for quiet moments as well, but in general, you're looking for those more exaggerated moments, those moments of like the decisive moment. And there's no decisive there. I don't think there are like any decisive moments in this book. It's all just like these. It was really an exercise in observation and meditation of sorts, looking for light, looking for meaning within his home, within moments, within our relationship, and then posing him for certain things in a way that felt like it was reflective of a certain emotion that I was feeling. I wouldn't say that any of the images are staged, but I would certainly like pose him in a certain lighting situation. So yeah, that was definitely a different workflow. And just because I was making all the images on this bulky film camera, it was a much slower process. And then, I would leave Sunday, get the images developed on Monday, and then get them back a few days later and have, that like I was slowly building the story week after week. Like because it wasn't immediate, I had so much time to think about, okay, what do I need to, how can I fill in the gaps this coming weekend and build the story that way?
Tell me about the dialogue that you guys had with each other when the idea for the project came about, because, going through this kind of treatment is you're vulnerable, both physically, emotionally, and in some ways, being as close as you guys were, one, access is, the whole issue of gaining access is kind of a moot point, but, you still are very intimate with each other, right? And, so that throws a little curveball in there that if you were just documenting someone you really didn't know, that whole dynamic would be very, very different. But tell me about, the kind of
initially it was really just
about the project,
conversation of me itself asking if it would be okay to bring my camera and again document him continuing to make work through his treatment. Because to me that was inspirational. That was a choice he was making. And once I got there, it was wild to see how much work he was continuing to create throughout this whole process. Like every weekend it's interesting because I was definitely at the bench making jewelry alongside Tom much more than I was making images, like hours wise. I was always thinking about making images, and if something happened where I felt like I needed to go do that, I would. And I was always up at sunrise and sunset out with my camera. But I think he just was like, whatever you want, I'm happy to help you. Like, I think for me, it was a really powerful experience because really early on, it was clear that while I was there to support him in certain ways and make this some sort of project, he was as excited to just support my vision as like it felt like more so like he just wanted to make sure that my project was good. You know what I mean? Like there was no nervousness. There was never any moment where he was like, oh, Dimitri, this is too much. Actually, like, can we stop? Can we put the camera away for a little while? He never got to there was never a moment like that. And it's interesting because with the Mamiya, it's a waist level finder on the RZ67. And it's interesting. I don't know what your experience is with using those types of cameras, but for me, there's been a couple moments where I've photographed people who I know really well. And because of the waist level finder, their face will be flipped backwards. And with that specific camera, there's been a couple moments like that where it's this almost like spiritual experience for me, where I'm looking at this person and seeing them in a new way for the first time. And I don't really recognize them because their face is flipped and I am so familiar with seeing their face. And that really happened with Tom the first time we did a portrait session. And for me, it became, in that moment, it was this interesting experience of, it felt like the tables had been turned, where my whole life, he was this person I looked up to as a mentor and even apprenticed under as a jeweler. But in that moment, and as I continued creating the project, the tables had turned, like the roles had been reversed. I was the artist and he was the subject of that art making. And of course it was incredibly collaborative, but that's how it felt to me, was just this wildly supportive artistic endeavor where he was just giving me full access. And none of the, I wasn't trying to like photograph really intimate details of the worst of it, and luckily because of the treatment, he wasn't, it wasn't like he was like vomiting all the time or anything like that, but that just wasn't what the work was about. So it didn't even require those kind of more vulnerable images to make what I was trying to make.
This episode is brought to you by altadinaphotographers.org, a community-based initiative supporting photographers who lost equipment and archives to the recent wildfires. The organization connects photographers in need with donors, individuals, and companies willing to help replace essential tools of the craft. From cameras to memory cards or lighting gear, every donation helps someone continue their goal to tell stories that matter. To support their effort or to find out how to help, visit altadinaphotographers.org. One of the interesting things of the book for me are the images of place. Of the Bayou itself. You have several images of like Spanish moss, that play. They're as much a character as Tom is, in the book. And that really struck me as very interesting because it really speaks to the idea of the evocative mood that's created by the selection of images, and the presence of that really helps in that case. And when did you kind of realize that those
I'm really glad that comes across.
Were going to play an important part in the project?
I mean, initially I was just, basically the place where he was staying was across the street from this park where there was a lot of Spanish moss. And initially I was just drawn to it visually, because I just love the way it looks. It's also very nostalgic for me because it's all over New Orleans, which is where I went to college. But then as I was getting the images back, I started laying them out pretty early on, like creating a maquette, not in any sort of final way, but just more as just a working draft to kind of get my ideas down. And very early on, just because Tom's hair was really long at the time and it kind of mirrored the images of the Spanish moss, it just became this very obvious visual connection and visual metaphor, I guess. And so once I kind of noticed that, which that happened within the first or second weekend, I was like, this is a motif that I'm going to be using. The idea that, the idea was that I was kind of trying to turn Tom into the Spanish moss in a way, like they're one and the same thing. And throughout the sequencing in the book, I think there's that was my intention. Like whether or not that specifically is how people read it, that doesn't really matter to me. But it was about, ultimately the idea was to create this metaphorical Bayou space. And for me, that space includes both Tom and the actual Bayou, and they're one and the same.
Yeah. I think, the use of metaphor is what makes this book really strong for me. I teach a class. I started teaching this class during COVID where people use their own lives as the material for a body of work.
Yeah.
And because of the nature of the circumstances around COVID, people were like stuck at home, right? So a lot of their images were as a result of them being sort of locked in. And so it was always very interesting to see certain images that served as sort of catalysts to make the images more than just documents of the things that are around the house, right? And oftentimes there would be just a couple of images that really elevated the work to a whole different level, where it wasn't just literal documentation, and that feeling, mood that came across. And that's kind of what I see, in this work, and why it strikes me as strongly as it does. But, coming from doing work that's more photojournalistic, documentary, the fact that you were able to recognize that, in that moment, what do you attribute that to? Because a lot of people wouldn't necessarily make that connection and do a more sort of straightforward,
that's a really
more
good
straightforward
question.
take on
And
the project.
I think it came from two places. I think on one hand, because I was working at the Capitol, making these images of the Senate that are so literal, I was just like, I was over it. I was like, I need to put my, we're shooting on these 5D Mark IVs, thousands of images a day or whatever. And I'm just like, it just like kind of was like, I don't want to look at another photo of, some guy holding a microphone. Like that's what it was like, I literally would joke with my friends. It's like, my job is just like taking photos of people with microphones.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just burnt out on that very literal work I was creating. And then at the same time, because of these late night conversations Tom and I were having, it was just, I was just feeling so energized to figure out what my voice was, to figure out what I wanted to say. And I think there were just a few images that I made very early on in the project that felt so different from anything I had ever created, just because of how soft they were, because of the film and because of the really low aperture and how that all played with the camera. For example, like there's this image of a couple books that he's like, you can see that Tom marked, there's like all these bookmarks all throughout the books. And it's about, I forget what the name of the book is, but it's like surviving prostate cancer or something like that. And you can just, because of the softness of it, it kind of takes it from this literal image somewhere else, just from a visual standpoint. But at least for me, seeing that image, it's like very emotional, because I'm imagining my close friend kind of frantically flipping through this book, figuring out like, how am I going to survive this? I don't want to die. And so to me, it was like, I'm not going to be able to show that experience of him flipping through the book necessarily, but just seeing the object and capturing it in a way that feels somewhat ethereal as opposed to just more literal felt like a much more authentic expression of what I was experiencing. So the timing of it
When did you
is
discover
also
your own diagnosis?
it was all just very bizarre and also strangely serendipitous, I guess, in a way. Not that there has to be like a silver lining to cancer treatment, but I started helping Tom on January 2nd of 2021, and I was diagnosed with my own cancer on January 4th, 2022. So it was like almost a year to the day, which,
Wow.
you know, I'm not religious, but I would say I'm very spiritual. And it just felt like one of those moments where it's like the universe was just like slapping me in the face, just telling me to like pay attention to this timing, pay attention to what you're experiencing. I had towards the end of 2021, after I'd already made all the images, and I took a photo book making workshop with Alejandro Cartagena. And so I'd already built a maquette, you know, which was certainly informed by that workshop, immensely informed by that workshop. So, and I was ready to hire a designer and start making the book. And so first week of January, I was diagnosed with cancer myself, and just, it became this bizarre experience where the maquette that I had created almost became a letter to myself, where the things that I had written about someone else's experience became these lessons that I was forced to internalize in a way that were now deeply personal, because I was having to go through my own version of cancer treatment.
Well, you know, can you give me more details in terms of, you know, how did you come to think that you might there was something wrong with certain symptoms, and specifically what type of cancer were you diagnosed with?
I'm happy to talk about any of the details, but basically I was diagnosed with testicular cancer, which is the most common cancer for men. I don't know, like 18 to 35 or something like that. So I was like definitely in that range. I was 29 when I was diagnosed. You know, I just felt a little lump and basically emailed my doctor, or emailed him through a portal, and was like, I was just like, there's a little lump here. I don't know what it is. In my mind, I was like, I don't need to go to this doctor and pull my pants down and have him tell me to get some imaging. So I was just like, let's skip that process and get the imaging. And within it was crazy, because the next day, I've never had an experience like this, but basically I get the ultrasound, and the same day or the next day, I get a call from a urologist's office that's like, hey, Dimitri, we have an appointment for you. Are you available this time or this time? And I'm like, who are you? Like, I've never heard of this office. So basically I go to this appointment, in this honestly very, very just matter of fact way, they're like, you have cancer. We need to do surgery. If we could do it today, we would, but we don't have any appointments for it. Are you free Wednesday? And it's like Monday. Yeah. So you know, ultimately I end up seeing another doctor just to kind of better understand it. Cause that first appointment, I was so, you know, I'm by myself learning I have cancer for the first time. Got this kind of confirmation that what they were telling me was very normal, that the cancer I had was luckily very curable, and that the first step was to just remove the tumor, which means like they're removing your testicle. So that, you know, there's like obviously a lot that I'm processing. Just, you know, luckily there's not, I don't know, maybe we can not include that in the podcast. But this is all to say that very quickly I'm going into surgery. And then as I'm healing from that surgery, I get a CT scan to confirm whether or not the cancer's already spread into my pelvis or even further. And unfortunately, it already had. So I had to, 3 weeks later, once I had mostly recovered from the surgery, I had to go through chemotherapy for 3 months. Yeah. I mean,
that must have been exhausting.
It was interesting because Tom didn't have to go through chemo. When he did this proton beam therapy, which is basically they install these targets in your prostate and then shoot it with lasers, which is wild. And it's intense in its own way, but it's not intense in the same way that chemo is, in that there's like those, you know, you're not nauseous all the time. You're not throwing up and all that. You're not losing your hair. And I had never like seen someone go through chemo firsthand. So I was very unfamiliar with what any of it was. Like my oncologist was explaining, oh, we're going to start chemo. And I was literally like, dude, what is chemo? Like literally, what is it? Is it a pill? Is it IV? Like I had no idea. And so I learned very quickly, basically because of the intensity of the medicine, they have to install this IV into your aortic valve. So they, literally install what's called a port into your chest. Because if the medicine that they were giving you went into your veins in your arms, by the end of your treatment, your veins would be destroyed. And so, you can imagine if that's what's happening, the intensity of what it's doing to the rest of your body. And it's obviously curing you of cancer. I'm very lucky and grateful to be cancer free over 3 years now. But the intensity of chemo is not something that I can kind of like underestimate, or I don't know.
Though your treatment was very different from Tom, did you nevertheless get some sort of takeaways in terms of what his experience was like and being able to make your experience more bearable?
Yeah.
I don't think easier is the right word, but that helped you to sort of,
I think,
to figure out how you wanted to walk through this.
Ultimately, like it felt like this moment where it feels like in a million ways I was supposed to help Tom through his treatment. But when all that happened, it felt like one of the reasons I was supposed to do it was to prepare myself for my own experience. And it was just because I felt like he handled it with such grace. Like, I'm sure there were moments where he didn't feel that way, but he was never like, he would get a little bit irritable here and there, but that's very understandable. And he was making work throughout the whole experience. And so for me, just having seen someone just do that, it kind of inspired me and encouraged me to, whenever I could, just do whatever I can. It was like just having this example of someone else just so bravely go through an experience like that and come out on the other end, and also come out in a way where both of us had kind of created this positive shared experience with each other. It just gave me a lot more courage to do my own version of that. And again, like every cancer treatment is going to be different, and while there were very few similarities with the specific symptoms that we were experiencing, I think mentally I definitely thought about him a lot of the time, and thought about, just being kind to the people around me, or trying to be, despite all the medicine that's making you feel genuinely insane.
Yeah. But how did that experience help change the way you looked at the book? In whatever state it was at the time you got your diagnosis.
So that's something I thought about quite a bit, because I had the choice. I could not include my experience. I could keep the book as it was, or finish the book about Tom, or I could incorporate my own experience in some way. And I was making images during that time of my own treatment, but they just were so different. And I also just didn't have the energy to invest in the same way as I had as I was supporting Tom. So, and I also didn't want to make it a book about me, It just felt like I had made this project about someone else's experience, and that's what the project needed to be primarily about. And then at the same time, it felt like if I excluded my own experience, I would be leaving out some of the story. So, as basically the book ends, there's the, credits of where it was printed, the copyright and all that stuff. And then it picks back up with, a few pages introducing you to me learning that I had cancer.
The book includes text, and they're in these interleaf pages, almost translucent, in which you have text, and some words are a little lighter than others. And I think it's a real interesting design choice. And I think that's one of the issues every photographer who's considering a book is always thinking about. It's like, do I include words? Do I not? but you do include them in the book, and I'm curious as to why. But the design choice I thought was really fascinating. So I would love for you to sort of explain.
When I was taking that workshop with Alejandro Cartagena, I was having a really hard time figuring out how to incorporate the text and the images, because it was like whenever I was creating my initial maquette, I was putting them next to each other. And it always felt like the words were taking away from the photos, and then the photos were taking away from the words. And at one point he showed us this book where the text was on these short sheets, not translucent sheets, but all the images were on were printed large, and then all the text was on these short sheets, which allowed you to kind of have this interplay between the two. And so I was thinking about that. I was thinking about short sheets and putting the text on that. And then I don't know, one day I thought like, oh, what about like translucent paper? And so the second maquette I made, that's the editing language that I was working with. And right away it like let the project sing in a way that it hadn't before, because then you can create a sequence. Like if you take all the text out of the book, I think the sequence still works really well. Like that's how I structured it. And that was really important to me. It was like, if there's no text, this still has, like, the feeling still has to come across. You obviously won't understand all the details. You won't know my background. You won't even know of my presence necessarily, but that's kind of how I was seeing it. And then once I created a sequence that I liked, that really worked, I could kind of just put the text, like I didn't have to think too much. Like the text just kind of fit in wherever it landed. And it ended up being this kind of problem solving design challenge with my incredible designer, Caleb Kane Marcus, who he's an incredible designer, does a lot of stuff with workshop arts. He designs a lot of books for Chris Graves as well, and tons of other photographers. But he really just, he helped me understand. He really like ratcheted everything up where he totally understood the idea I was going for. But then, I don't know, like the cover, for example, that was his idea. The idea to put some of the text, like like those moments where there are words missing and then on the page behind it, the text is there. That was his idea. So it's just all these, like, he just turned everything up like 15% or whatever. And it just made the book, he just re-emphasized the general idea that I had already had. And really,
yeah, because that cover is quite striking. It has basically strands
and that was
thread
something,
or fabric,
because of bookmaking and the technology that's going into it. Like that's not even an idea that I would have been able to conceive of, because I don't understand the technology enough to know how to sew a book like that. And so that was a collaboration between him and the printing press in Italy, ABC Tipografica. And they were incredibly helpful, just being open to collaborate, being open to kind of push the envelope of bookmaking and do something that I've personally never seen that before. And it took a few iterations to get to the point where the cover looked good and looked like what we wanted it to look like.
How did you find him, the designer, to work on this book? And why did you think it was important to work with the designer?
I just, I follow the photo book world pretty closely. I think I had initially found out about Caleb through his work with Chris Graves, because he designs a ton of books for him. And then I just followed Caleb more closely, and there were a couple projects that he had that really felt like the form of the book was emphasizing every aspect of the book was emphasizing every aspect of the book was emphasizing the goals of the project in a way that some traditional photo books, they're not trying to do. Like they're trying to just have it that it's like, obviously it's always interplay between text, layout, sequencing, pairing, all that. But I think Caleb's pushing it to a new level where he's really trying to push the medium forward. And for me, I wasn't necessarily trying to do something innovative initially. It was just it felt like he was a partner that initially just really understood the project. Like when I had my first meeting with him and was trying to figure out if I was going to hire him, he just really, it seemed like he really understood the project. He had empathy in a way that made me feel comfortable working with him. And then once we got into it, it was just, again, he was just taking my ideas and taking them to the next level, so it just was a really easy, and he was just like gentle throughout the whole process. He never pushed me to say yes to anything. Sometimes it took me a moment to like get to liking the design changes he was making. But in the end, I think there were only one or two very minor things that I said no to. It was basically everything he put out there. I was like, yeah, this is awesome. Let's do it.
And what was involved in the funding of the project?
Luckily, I'm really grateful to have a small but mighty mailing list of people who I would say like just really support my work. And so I think about half of the printing was covered through pre-sales, and then I fronted the rest of it. So it was a wildly expensive project, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't like I was fronting the money all from my savings. And at a certain point, it just like wasn't about the money at all. Like I don't know if I can't print a book that is this expensive every year or every 3 years, but I was just so excited to get it out in the world and I just wanted to do it right, that working with a printing press that we really trusted was really important to me. And ultimately, like, seeing that money leaving my bank account was stressful, but it was just like, I just have to do this. It wasn't something I was like really there was never like an option to not do it.
Yeah. What was Tom's reaction to the finished product?
Tom absolutely loved the book. I mean, I think he had never had a book made about him. Like, he's published his own books about jewelry. I would say he's definitely a character and a known figure in the craft jewelry world, but this was very different than that. It wasn't about his reputation. It wasn't even so much about his jewelry specifically. It was about like him as a person, So I think he was surprised, he was honored, and just because we're so close, like family, he just like grateful to have been able to make the project together.
You spoke earlier about sort of the soul deadening work that you were doing at the Capitol. At the Capitol, and that this was very, very life affirming, even though it was facing mortality, not only Tom's but your own. How has this sort of brought perspective to the kind of work that you want to do, going forward?
I mean, I think the thing about photography is that we're often telling other people's stories, whether that's a commercial client, a restaurant. For me, I do a lot of restaurant work here in Austin. I love doing that work. I shoot for the New York Times and other publications like that. And again, I love that work. But coming out of cancer treatment and having created this project and having a really solid understanding of the work, like my own personal work, I think it's really important for me in my own mind to articulate when I'm telling someone else's story and when I'm telling my own story, or when I'm focusing on a story that is something that I'm personally interested in. And I think just going through cancer treatment, for me, it is like a before and after. And I think I just now have much less patience for time spent doing something that I don't want to do. And that, I'm not above anything. Like I still, whatever, like I'll still shoot. I'll say yes to pretty much anything, but as much as I can, I prioritize my own practice. And I think ultimately, like whenever I see my favorite photographers work, their best work is always motivated by their own artistic output, or if they're purely photojournalists. I remember Ryan Christopher Jones came to this Austin photo night that I attend all the time, and he was showing us project after project, and it's like all the best ones were like things that he came up with, and this was years ago when I had just moved to Austin. And over again, when I would meet photographers who I admired, whose work I loved, it would just be the same thing where it's like, oh yeah, none of this was assigned. This was all my personal work. And so it's like, I think there's this idea that like, oh, like the Times or whoever is going to assign me this dream project, but it's just not, it very rarely happens. And that's okay. That work is, I still love doing that work and will continue doing that work. But if I'm not prioritizing my own personal work above any other photography work, that's when I start to get into a place of like agitation or frustration or burnout.
Yeah, that's an important lesson for any photographer.
For sure.
Because I've been doing this show, God, almost 20 years now. And that's like one of the through lines for so many of the people who I end up talking to. It's like the work that means so much to the audience and means so much to them is always something very, very personal.
Yeah.
Something you have a passion about.
I know we're like up in an hour, but there's like a couple of details that I just really wanted to make sure to include.
Sure, please.
So one thing that I wanted to mention was just that, so the idea to basically the book ends and then I introduce my own experience with learning that I had cancer. And what's interesting, I've done a lot of fairs and I've sold this book and I've been able to watch people flip through it. And from my own experience, it's interesting because a lot of people know that I had cancer and choose not to ask about it or just feel uncomfortable asking about it. And I think most of the time it comes from this place of trying to be polite or not wanting to make me feel uncomfortable. But my own experience has just been that part of myself is hidden for a lot of people just because it doesn't come up or they don't ask about it. And so I wanted the form of the book to mirror that experience. So that was the reason why I chose to end it and have the paper stock changes. And I think there's probably people who already own the book who don't even get to that part of it, who might not even read it, which I love. And it kind of emphasizes how the experience has been to me. And then separately, what I've thought about and what I hope for is that more and more people who don't know me will read this book, because it's interesting. And what I love about books is that I expect there are 500 copies of this book that exist, and most of them will hopefully outlive me just because of the physical nature of the object. And as I get further and further removed from the story, as I die, I'll become more of a character as opposed to this actual person who wrote the book, you know? And I think, because what often happens is when, and I appreciate that it didn't come up in this conversation, but people will always ask me when I tell them I wrote a book about cancer, I made a book about cancer, like, oh, is Tom okay? How are you doing? Are you okay? And it's like, well, I'm not dead if that's what you're asking me, obviously. But to me, that's not what the book was ever about. And it's left very open-ended intentionally. Like, you don't know what happens to me and Tom. And my hope is that without knowing if we live or die, that you still get something beautiful from this book, that you still have a better understanding of life and death, of art making, of love, of light, of all the themes of the book, that I hope that it forces people to ask themselves, what does it mean to be close to the Bayou? Like, what does that mean to you? What does that mean to the people you care about? If that metaphorical space is something that you resonate with.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you for adding that.
Yeah.
Well, my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend another photographer for our listeners to discover and explore on their own. And it can be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be and why?
I think, and this is because I've just been obsessively reading his book. I've flipped through it several times in the last couple of days. Raymond Thompson Jr., he's a photojournalism professor at UT, but I would say his work is much more, it kind of blurs the line between art and photojournalism in a really beautiful way. His new book, it's called It's Hard to Stop Rebels That Time Travel. And it's one of the most incredible photo books that I've ever experienced. And I would highly recommend checking it out.
Well, I definitely will. That's a great title, just alone.
Yeah. It's incredible. To me, and I don't know if, I don't want to like put words in Raymond's mouth at all, but it kind of like, and I forget the name of the project, Dawood Bey's project, where he's photographing the Underground Railroad sites in Ohio. It feels like it almost like picks up where he left off and kind of goes in a slightly different direction, exploring Raymond's own family's history. It's an absolutely incredible book. I would highly recommend reading it.
Thanks.
Experiencing it.
Yeah, thanks for that recommendation, and thank you for your time, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation. I've been a fan of the podcast for a while, so it's amazing to be on here.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks to Dimitri for sharing his work and his story. You can find out more by visiting DimitriStaszewski.com or follow him on Instagram. To support the show financially, you can visit us on Patreon or make a one-time contribution at buymeacoffee.com/thecandidframe. Links for both are in our website and show notes. We've also relaunched our newsletter on Substack, where I write about not only this show, but books, videos, and other content that I think you'd be interested in. Subscribe today and be part of the conversation. And remember, if you ever have trouble finding any episode of the show, you can download the Candid Frame app, and it's available for free for both iOS and Android. Our audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker. And this is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame.